What if the loneliest path you've ever walked was not a punishment, but a confirmation? What if the silence around you was not rejection, but initiation? And what if the reason you feel out of place in the crowd is because you were never meant to follow it? Stay with me, because by the end of this speech you may realize that walking alone is not a sign of being lost, but a sign that something within you has already been found. There comes a moment in a man's life when the noise of the world no longer entertains him. The applause feels hollow, the race feels meaningless, and the roles he was told to play begin to feel like costumes that no longer fit. At first, this feels like loss. Friends drift away, conversations lose depth, crowds begin to exhaust rather than excite, and the man asks himself, why do I feel so alone? But this is not the beginning of isolation, this is the beginning of clarity. Loneliness is not a curse placed upon a man, it is often a signal that something within him has begun to wake up. When awareness sharpens, the familiar world starts to feel strangely distant. The conversations that once felt safe begin to sound repetitive. The goals that once seemed important begin to feel borrowed. This sense of being alone does not arrive because the man has failed to connect with others, but because he has begun to connect with himself. And that connection rearranges everything. The world teaches men to fear loneliness, to see it as a flaw, a weakness, a sign that something has gone wrong. But in truth, loneliness often appears when something has finally gone right. It shows up when the inner voice becomes louder than the outer noise, when the man no longer needs constant distraction to avoid himself. At this stage, solitude is not emptiness, it is space. Space where the mind can stretch, where emotions can settle, where questions long ignored finally surface. Most people avoid this space because it exposes them, it removes the masks, it dissolves the stories they tell themselves to stay comfortable. But the spiritually chosen man does not run from this exposure. He sits with it. He allows the silence to speak. And what the silence reveals is not always pleasant, but it is always honest. Loneliness, then, becomes a kind of initiation. It strips away false companionship and reveals whether a man can stand in his own presence without escaping. Those who cannot return quickly to the noise, those who can begin to transform. As this transformation unfolds, the man starts to see something unsettling about the crowd. He notices that much of what people do is driven not by understanding, but by fear. Fear of being left out, fear of being judged, fear of standing still while others move. The crowd moves together not because it knows where it is going, but because moving together feels safer than moving alone. Agreement becomes a shelter, tradition becomes a hiding place, and repetition becomes mistaken for truth. The spiritually chosen man begins to sense this, not with arrogance, but with clarity. He sees how opinions are inherited, how beliefs are copied, how ambitions are absorbed without question, and once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. He finds himself unable to follow paths simply because they are popular. He hesitates where others rush. He questions where others repeat. This hesitation isolates him, not because he rejects people, but because he refuses to betray his own perception. The crowd often mistakes this refusal for rebellion or pride, but it is neither. It is awareness. Awareness that living unconsciously is easier but not fulfilling. Awareness that fear is a poor compass even though it is widely used. The chosen man begins to understand that belonging purchased at the cost of truth is too expensive. He notices how fear keeps people busy, noisy, constantly validating each other's choices to avoid facing their own uncertainty. And so he steps back. He walks alone not to separate himself from humanity, but to see it clearly. From this distance he observes how fear creates urgency, how urgency creates imitation, and how imitation creates crowds moving very fast in very similar directions. He realizes that awareness moves differently. It moves slowly, it pauses, it listens. It does not need consensus to exist. And because of this, it often travels without company, through quiet spaces where there is no applause, no validation, only the steady unfolding of understanding. Before a man can offer anything meaningful to the world, he must first be separated from it, not as a punishment, not as a rejection, but as a preparation. Spiritual growth demands distance because clarity rarely forms in the middle of noise. When a man is constantly surrounded by voices telling him who he should be, what he should want, and how he should live, his own perception becomes diluted. He may function well, appear successful, and even feel temporarily satisfied, yet something within him remains unformed. Separation creates the conditions necessary for inner development. It removes the constant reinforcement of borrowed identities and exposes the raw material of the self. In this space, a man is no longer supported by agreement. He cannot lean on applause or distraction. He must meet himself directly, without witnesses, without reassurance. This encounter is uncomfortable because it reveals the gap between who he has been performing as and who he actually is. But this discomfort is not destructive, it is corrective. It forces honesty. It compels the man to confront motives that were previously hidden beneath habit and social approval. Without separation, contribution is shallow because it is based on imitation rather than understanding. With separation, something original begins to form. In solitude, the man starts to see how much of his life was shaped by unconscious adaptation. He remembers decisions made not from conviction but from convenience. He recognizes dreams that were never truly his, fears that were inherited, and values that were absorbed without examination. This recognition is not accompanied by guilt so much as clarity. He realizes that to contribute something real, he must first subtract what is false. Separation becomes an act of refinement. Like removing excess material to reveal a form already present, the man sheds layers of conditioning that once defined him. This process cannot happen in crowds because crowds reward conformity. They soften the edges of individuality. They offer belonging in exchange for agreement. In separation, there is no such exchange. There is only the question of alignment. Does this thought feel true? Does this action feel honest? Does this direction feel alive? These questions grow louder in solitude, and because there are no external answers, the man must listen inwardly. This inward listening restructures him. It slows him down, it deepens his perception, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his presence changes. When he eventually returns to the world, he does not come back to seek approval or to prove anything. He returns with something shaped, something earned through inner labor. His contribution is no longer an echo of what already exists, but an expression of what has been understood. Silence plays a central role in this transformation, because silence is not empty, it is an environment. It is a field in which subtle things become visible. When the constant stimulation of sound, conversation, and activity falls away, the mind initially rebels. It produces noise of its own. Old memories surface. Unresolved emotions rise. Anxieties that were previously masked by busyness demand attention. This is why many people fear silence. They mistake it for loneliness, when in truth it is confrontation. Silence removes the distractions that normally protect a person from themselves. For the spiritually chosen man, silence becomes a classroom, not because it teaches through instruction, but because it reveals through exposure. In silence, patterns become obvious. The man notices how certain thoughts repeat, how certain emotional reactions arise automatically, how certain fears dictate behavior without being questioned. This observation is transformative because it introduces space between awareness and reaction. The man is no longer fully identified with every thought that passes through his mind. He begins to witness them rather than obey them. Silence creates this witnessing. It allows the man to see that he is not his impulses, not his fears, not even his past. He is the awareness observing them. As time in silence deepens, the man becomes more attuned to subtleties. He notices the difference between intuition and impulse, between desire and conditioning. He senses when an action arises from fear and when it arises from clarity. This sensitivity cannot be developed in constant interaction, because interaction demands response. Silence allows pause. And in that pause, understanding emerges. The man begins to trust stillness not as inactivity, but as intelligence. He realizes that much of what passes for certainty in the world is simply noise repeated, often enough to feel solid. In silence, that solidity dissolves. What remains is something quieter but more stable, a sense of inner orientation that does not depend on external validation. This orientation becomes the foundation of the man's actions. He no longer moves to escape discomfort or to chase recognition. He moves because something within him aligns with the movement. Silence sharpens this alignment. It strips away urgency. It replaces compulsion with choice. The man learns that not every thought requires engagement, not every emotion requires expression, and not every opportunity requires pursuit. This restraint is not suppression, it is discernment. Silence teaches discernment by slowing the inner tempo enough for clarity to arise. Through continued exposure to silence, the man also begins to sense his connection to something larger than his individual concerns. Without constant stimulation pulling his attention outward, awareness naturally expands. He perceives patterns in his own life that mirror patterns in nature, in relationships, in cycles of effort and rest. This perception fosters humility, not insignificance. He understands that he is a part of something vast, yet uniquely positioned within it. This understanding dissolves the need to constantly assert identity. The man becomes comfortable with not explaining himself, not defining himself, not defending his path. Silence has shown him that meaning does not need to be announced to exist. It simply unfolds. And because of this, his presence gains a quiet strength. When he speaks, his words carry weight because they emerge from listening. When he acts, his actions feel deliberate because they are not rushed. Silence has trained him to respond rather than react, to observe before intervening, to understand before judging. It has shown him that wisdom is not accumulated through noise, but revealed through attention. And this attention, once cultivated, continues to guide him even when he re-enters the world, shaping his interactions, his decisions, and the way he stands within the movement of life. Belonging has a power, full emotional pull because it promises safety. From an early age, a man learns that acceptance reduces conflict and that agreement keeps him connected. Over time, this lesson hardens into a quiet rule: do not stray too far from what is familiar, or you risk being alone. Yet alignment asks a different question, one that is far less comfortable. It asks whether a man's actions are in harmony with his inner understanding, regardless of how they are received. Choosing alignment over belonging often feels like stepping off solid ground because the rewards are not immediate. There is no applause for inner honesty. There is no guarantee of companionship when a man refuses to compromise what feels true to him. And so, when a spiritually chosen man begins to prioritize alignment, relationships shift. Some weaken, some dissolve, not because he becomes distant or unkind, but because he can no longer participate in patterns that require him to betray himself. This loss is frequently misunderstood, both by others and by the man himself. He may question whether he is becoming too rigid, too withdrawn, too different. But alignment is not rigidity. It is coherence. It is the state in which a man's thoughts, words, and actions no longer contradict each other, and coherence creates a kind of inner stability that belonging alone cannot provide. When a man is aligned, he no longer needs constant affirmation to feel real. He does not rely on others to reflect his worth back to him. This independence can appear threatening to those who are still anchored to external validation. They may interpret it as detachment or arrogance, when in reality it is presence. The aligned man listens fully, engages sincerely, but does not disappear into agreement simply to maintain harmony. He understands that false harmony breeds quiet resentment, while honest difference creates space for genuine connection. Alignment refines the quality of his relationships, even as it reduces their quantity. The connections that remain are no longer built on mutual avoidance of discomfort, but on shared authenticity. These relationships can withstand silence, disagreement, and distance because they are not dependent on performance. The man begins to see that belonging rooted in pretense is a fragile thing. It collapses the moment truth enters the room. Alignment, by contrast, may initially isolate, but it ultimately attracts resonance. Not many, but enough. Not loudly, but deeply. This shift changes the man's orientation towards social life. He no longer asks how to fit in. He asks how to remain intact. And in preserving his integrity, he becomes more available, not less. Available to listen without needing to impress. Available to care without needing to control. Available to stand alone without feeling abandoned. This inner stability becomes the foundation for a different kind of strength. The man who has learned to stand in alignment does not crumble when misunderstood. He does not rush to explain himself or to correct every misinterpretation. He has discovered that being true is more important than being understood. This does not make him indifferent to others. It makes him grounded within himself. And this grounding allows him to show up with greater compassion. Because he is no longer negotiating his own worth in every interaction, he can meet others without hidden agendas. He can allow people to be where they are without needing them to agree with him. Alignment removes the desperation from connection. It replaces it with choice. The man chooses his words carefully, his commitments deliberately, his boundaries respectfully. He understands that saying no is sometimes an act of self-respect, not rejection. And this respect for himself extends naturally to others. He does not demand alignment from the world, he simply maintains it within himself. From this place, solitude takes on a new meaning. It is no longer a state of absence, but a state of readiness. The spiritually chosen man does not remain isolated forever. Solitude is not his destination, it is his preparation. Through walking alone, he has learned to listen, to discern, to align. And when he re-enters the world, he does so without losing himself. He is no longer swept away by collective anxiety or distracted by constant comparison. He moves through social paces with ease because he is not seeking completion there. His sense of wholeness is already established. This makes his presence stabilizing. Others feel less rushed around him. Conversations slow down. Reactions soften. Not because he imposes calm, but because he embodies it. His strength is not loud. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency, through patience, through the absence of pretense. He is no longer trying to be someone. He is simply being. This return is subtle. The man does not come back with answers for everyone. He does not position himself above others or apart from them. He comes back as a participant, but not a follower. He engages with the world without being consumed by it. He contributes without needing recognition. He influences without forcing change. This is the quiet authority that solitude cultivates. It is not derived from status or dominance, but from self-knowledge. Having faced himself in silence, having chosen alignment over belonging, the man carries an inner compass that guides him regardless of circumstance. When chaos arises, he does not immediately react. When conflict appears, he does not immediately defend. When opportunity presents itself, he does not immediately grasp. He has learned that not every invitation is meant to be accepted, and not every challenge is meant to be fought. This discernment allows him to act with precision rather than urgency. As he moves among others, his compassion deepens. Having experienced isolation, he recognizes it in others without judgment. He understands the fear beneath conformity, the longing beneath performance, the exhaustion beneath constant striving. This understanding does not make him superior, it makes him gentle. He knows that everyone is navigating their own level of awareness, their own timing. And so he does not try to awaken others prematurely. He simply lives in a way that demonstrates another possibility. His life becomes an invitation rather than an argument. People are drawn to him not because he promises certainty, but because he offers presence. And presence is rare. It cannot be manufactured. It emerges only when a man is no longer fragmented by competing identities and expectations. Solitude has unified him. Alignment has stabilized him. And from this stability, he interacts with the world not as someone seeking refuge, but as someone offering steadiness.